Living things are classified in many different ways. We, in our class, classify things most broadly as either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. So here's the word eukaryotic versus prokaryotic. And I say that that's the most broadest classification, but we're not going to really talk yet much about the difference between something that's prokaryotic and eukaryotic. The probably most important piece to the distinction between those two is that prokaryotic organisms have cells because the cell is the most basic unit of anything alive, but they have cells that don't have a nucleus. Now, the word nucleus is also not something that we're going to talk much about yet, but it is one of a few compartments or organelles within cells. And prokaryotic organisms, lack any kind of internal cellular structure, or at least not to the extent that eukaryotic cells have. So these are the more simple cells. These are all unicellular. It says here most are unicellular. There are a few just a few examples of things that are multicellular, but most of them are unicellular. All that we think about are going to be unicellular. And then the eukaryotes can be either unicellular or multicellular. Now, to kind of narrow down classification a little bit finer, there are 3 domains of living things. There are the bacteria, the archaea, and then the eukarya. Everything that's eukaryotic has cells that contain nuclei fall within this domain. The prokaryotes are both the bacteria and the archaea. The domain bacteria is the types of bacteria that you think of as like common bacteria, so E. coli or staph or streptococcus, bacteria that are common. Archaea are prokaryotic, but they are the extremophiles, things that only require extreme environments, so high temperatures, so like boiling temperatures, and the thermal vents in the ocean contain archaea, high salt, extreme pH conditions. These are not common prokaryotes. But both types are made up of prokaryotic cells that lack a lot of internal structure. And again, most of these are unicellular. The eukaryotes include things as simple as protists, which are primarily unicellular, and then the more complex things like animals. So we, of course, fall into the kingdom Animalia, and this is one of the 4 kingdoms within the domain Eukarya. Animals and protists, and then fungi and plants. These are all part of the Eukarya domain. Now I have here a phylogenetic tree. This depicts lines of evolutionary descent of different species. So here is a phylogenetic tree that represents the evolutionary descent of the 3 domains. And it represents the evolutionary descent from a common ancestor. So here's our common ancestor of life, and evolution led to the development of bacteria, eukarya, but also archaea. So very generally, archaea are more closely related. This is usually a DNA phylogenetic tree, more closely related to eukarya. Trees like this, and there are all sorts of trees that are created in different ways, but they're useful for organizing biological diversity, classifying organisms, and providing insight into the events that occurred during evolution. So every time you see a node, that is a common ancestor. Last thing I want to show you as far as the organization of living things is to think about what we can actually see and what we can't see. So everything in blue is visible with the unaided eye. Everything in red is too small to see without a microscope. Atoms built to make molecules, molecules that are found within organelles of cells. These are all things that we can't see without a microscope. Now, there are exceptions. I'll talk about different types of cells that we can actually see with an unaided eye. But for the most part, cells are no more than 100 micrometers in size. So we can't see them unless we have a microscope. And then everything above that, with a few exceptions, certainly some organs of some smaller multicellular organisms we maybe couldn't see without a microscope. But most of these fall within the range of what we can see with our unaided eye. So we're going to look primarily at all things and processes that we can't actually visualize. Most of what we're going to look at this semester is either under an electron microscope or like a artist rendition of what we think is happening. Right, so our next video is a look into how we study living things, how all that we know, and that's all found in our textbook and in our lecture videos, how it was discovered, how people study living things.